The hum of the hallway light flickers above me as I stand in the doorway, listening to my own wife and son whisper about when I'm finally out of the way. Still, I keep my hand on the wall, letting the light's buzz calm the punch sitting behind my ribs. As that electric tremble grows, it crawls through me, exposing every crack I ignored in our marriage and our blood. While the glow stutters, so do the excuses I once made for the people I trusted most. The same trembling light shows me the truth. Family can rot from the inside. That's when I decide, if they plan my ending, I'll write the next chapter myself. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Hank Dalton had never been a deep sleeper, not even back in the days when his hands were steady and his mind didn't wander the way it sometimes did now. But tonight, something pulled him from sleep abruptly, like a hand gripping the back of his shirt. His eyes snapped open, the room still steeped in darkness except for a faint silver streak of moonlight bleeding through the blinds. The old farmhouse was quiet for half a second. Then he heard it, a soft, deliberate creak from the floorboards downstairs. Another, then one more. Footsteps, slow, careful, as if whoever was moving didn't want him to hear. Hank stared at the red glow of the digital clock beside him. 1:40 a.m., too late or too early for anyone to be up. His first thought was that it might be the furnace again, expanding in the cold. But the sound wasn't mechanical, it was human. And there was something unnerving about the pacing of it, the hesitancy. Whoever was walking wasn't comfortable. They were waiting, listening, adjusting their weight the way people do when they're trying not to disturb a sleeping house. He pushed himself upright, his joints protesting with a dull ache. He held his breath, trying to catch the noise again. That's when he heard it, a whisper. A low one drifting upward from the first floor, a woman's voice at first. He recognized it instantly, Carol. It sounded strained, almost rushed, like she was trying to keep herself calm. Then another voice joined, male, younger, clipped. His son, Mark. They were talking softly, too softly for Hank to make out any words, but the tone alone made his stomach tighten. It wasn't the warmth of a late-night chat or the casual rhythm of familiar conversation. It felt covert. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood slowly, waiting for the room to stop spinning as the blood settled. The whisper stopped. Silence filled the hallway so completely that Hank wondered if he'd imagined everything. But then a new sound drifted up, fabric shifting, maybe someone brushing against the counter, maybe someone freezing because they heard him move. He opened the bedroom door. It gave a faint click, echoing like a gunshot in the quiet house. Down the dim hallway, faint light glowed from the kitchen, just enough to cast a pale rectangle across the floor. Hank stepped into the hall, probing the shadows. As soon as his foot touched the creaking plank he knew so well, the murmurs below cut off instantly, as if a switch had been flipped. He walked down the hallway until Carol appeared at the bottom of the staircase. Her posture was calm, her expression soft, almost too soft, as if she had practiced looking unbothered. She held a half-empty glass of water, offering him a small, careful smile. "Just getting water, honey," she said, the words smooth, rehearsed. Her voice didn't match the tension he'd heard moments before. Behind her, Mark stood near the counter, arms folded, his face unreadable in the faint kitchen light. Hank nodded slowly, still scanning the room for something out of place, something to explain what he'd heard. But everything looked normal. The mug drying by the sink, the mail pile on the table, the coat draped over the chair. Everything except the lingering sense that he had walked into the end of a conversation he wasn't supposed to hear. "Didn't mean to startle you," he murmured, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to reassure, Carol, Mark, or himself. He returned to the bedroom, the boards groaning under his weight. When he settled back under the blankets, the chill of the room seemed sharper, sinking through the cotton and into his chest. He lay still, eyes on the ceiling, listening. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 5, no footsteps, no voices, just silence thick enough to press against his ears. Something in it felt wrong, like the house was holding its breath. Hank wasn't a suspicious man by nature. He'd spent a lifetime trusting the people closest to him, Carol especially. They had built 40-plus years of marriage on quiet routines and unspoken loyalty. But lying there in the dark, Hank couldn't shake the image of Carol's forced smile or the faint tremor in her voice. And Mark, why had he been awake? Why had I hushed so quickly. His mind drifted back to the last few months. Mark moving in temporarily, the strange moods, the nights when Carol stayed up late even though she always claimed she was exhausted. Little oddities he dismissed at the time suddenly felt connected, woven into a pattern he didn't yet understand. He exhaled slowly and closed his eyes, not because he was tired, he wasn't anymore, but because he wanted to listen without them knowing. Maybe they would start talking again once they believed he'd gone back to sleep. Maybe he could piece together what had been whispered downstairs. But the house remained silent for the rest of the night, too silent. Hank turned onto his side, his heart pulsing with something unfamiliar, unease edged with a sting of betrayal. He didn't know what they were hiding, but tonight had made one thing clear. Whatever his wife and son were discussing, they waited for him to fall asleep before doing it. And as the faintest light of dawn began touching the curtains, Hank made a quiet promise to himself. Tomorrow night he wouldn't sleep at all. Hank spent the whole next day replaying the sounds from the night before, each whisper, each creak, each moment he felt like a stranger inside his own home. He moved through the house slowly, quietly, as if the walls might speak if he listened long enough. Carol acted normal, humming while she folded laundry, chatting about groceries and the weather, but there was a tightness around her eyes that hadn't been there before. Mark kept his distance, slipping out back for long phone calls he never explained. Neither of them mentioned the late-night meeting. Neither asked if Hank had slept well. It was as if the whole thing had been erased from their memories. But that night when the clock glowed 1:32 a.m., Hank was wide awake. He lay still on his back, breathing evenly, carefully, letting his chest rise and fall in slow, measured waves. He kept his eyes shut but angled his ear toward the bedroom door, waiting for proof that he hadn't imagined anything at all. At 1:40, like clockwork, the door eased open with the softest click. Carol's silhouette drifted into the room. She leaned over him close enough that he felt the faint warmth of her breath. Then he heard it, the quiet inhale, the listening, the subtle count. She was checking him, checking if he was asleep. Her fingers hovered near his cheek, trembling just enough that he almost opened his eyes. But he didn't. He stayed completely still, letting her examine him the way someone would examine a fragile object. After a few seconds, she exhaled shakily, then turned and left the room. He waited 5 more seconds, then slid out of bed. The hall felt colder than usual. He stepped carefully, avoiding the boards he knew creaked, following the faint glow drifting up from downstairs. As he moved down the staircase, he paused just before the last step, staying hidden behind the banister. Carol and Mark stood in the kitchen, their backs partially turned. Their voices were low but sharp with tension. "We don't have much time," Mark said. Carol rubbed her arms like she was trying to hold herself together. "We have to be careful. He can't know yet." Hank's stomach knotted, keeping it from him, timing, words that sounded like pieces of a sentence he wasn't meant to hear. Then he heard something he never expected, Carol sniffing, a soft, muffled cry. She wiped at her eyes quickly, almost angry at the tears. Carol didn't cry, not for anyone, not for anything. She was always the strong one, the composed one. To see her unraveling in the dim kitchen light made something inside Hank twist painfully. "Mom," Mark said, lowering his voice, "it's only a matter of weeks." Weeks. The word echoed in Hank's skull like a hammer striking metal. Only a matter of weeks until what? What were they planning? What were they hiding? He pressed closer to the railing, but the shadows felt like they were closing in on him, tightening around his throat. Carol leaned her hands on the counter, shoulders trembling. "I know, I wish we didn't have to do this behind his back." Mark placed a hand on her shoulder, but his posture wasn't comforting. It was tense, rigid, like he was holding something inside himself too tightly. We're doing the right thing. We don't want him panicking. Not now. Panic, weeks, timing, keeping it from him. Hank felt his pulse thudding against his temples. Then disaster. The stair under Hank's foot let out a faint, betraying groan. It wasn't loud, but it sliced through the quiet like a blade. Carol's head snapped up instantly. Mark went still, eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the staircase. The kitchen fell into sudden, heavy silence. Hank froze, barely breathing. He hoped they couldn't see the shadow of his foot hanging over the last step. Carol whispered, "Did you hear that?" Mark nodded, jaw tightening. "Go check on him." Hank backed up the stairs soundlessly, moving faster than he had in years, slipping back into the bedroom with the stealth of a man half his age. He slid under the blankets just as he heard Carol climbing the stairs. He forced his breathing back into that smooth, steady rhythm. His chest rose and fell as if he had never left the bed. The bedroom door opened. Carol stood in the doorway, watching him for several long seconds. He kept his eyes closed, his face calm, though he could feel a bead of sweat crawling down his temple. After a while, she stepped inside, listening again, counting again, before finally retreating. Her footsteps faded. The house returned to stillness, but nothing inside Hank was still. He stared at the ceiling long after she left, the weight of their words pressing down on him like a heavy blanket he couldn't push off. A matter of weeks, keeping something from him. Carol crying. None of it made sense. None of it fit the wife and son he believed he knew. Fear crawled up his spine, meeting confusion halfway. He felt suspended between two truths, what he heard and what he desperately hoped wasn't true. Eventually he closed his eyes, not to sleep, but because he couldn't bear the darkness any longer. And somewhere deep in his chest, a cold certainty formed. Whatever they were hiding, it was getting closer. The next morning, sunlight seeped through the kitchen blinds, but it did nothing to warm the uneasiness sitting heavy in Hank's chest. Carol hummed softly while packing her purse, reminding him she had errands in town. Mark said he was heading out too, avoiding Hank's eyes as he grabbed his jacket. Their movements were normal on the surface, routine, casual, but something beneath the surface felt choreographed, like both were performing normalcy instead of living it. When the house finally fell silent, Hank stood in the middle of the kitchen listening. No creaks, no whispers, no footsteps. For the first time in days, he was alone. He didn't waste a second. He moved toward the basement door, fingers brushing the old brass knob. The basement had always been Carol's territory more than his, where she kept boxes of holiday decorations, old family albums, cartons of things she swore she would sort one day. Hank descended the wooden steps, each one giving a familiar groan. The air grew cooler, tinged with dust and the faint smell of old cardboard. He began searching, not even sure what he was looking for. He checked the shelves, pushed aside paint cans, rummaged through crates filled with half-broken tools and forgotten memories. The deeper he went, the heavier his chest felt. Something down here somewhere held answers. That's when he saw it. A tarp in the corner, tucked behind the furnace, covering something oddly shaped. He approached slowly, gripping the edge. When he pulled it back, dust drifted up in a lazy cloud, revealing a small metal box, the size of a toolbox but heavier looking, with a thick padlock securing the latch. Hank crouched and picked it up. Cold, solid, too deliberate to be random storage. He shook it gently, something inside shifted, something dense, something that didn't sound like holiday ornaments or old photos. The box had no label, no markings, nothing to hint at its purpose. As he turned it over in his hands, he felt a tight prick of dread along his spine. Why hide this? Why lock it? Why tuck it under a tarp where no one would ever casually find it? He carried it to the workbench and ran his thumb over the lock. He could break it open if he needed to. He still had his old tools. But before he reached for anything, the sound of a car door slamming outside made him freeze. Carol wasn't supposed to be home for hours. Footsteps approached the house. The front door opened, then Hank, Carol's voice echoed faintly down the basement stairs. He barely had time to set the box down before she hurried down the steps. Her eyes found the metal box instantly. Her entire expression changed, soft features tightening into something sharp and panicked. "What are you doing with that?" she snapped, breath quickening. "I just found it," Hank said carefully. "Under the tarp. I was looking for, I don't know, answers, I guess." Carol moved fast, faster than he'd seen her move in years. She grabbed the box from the table and clutched it to her chest like it was something alive, something fragile. "You shouldn't be going through things down here," she said, voice trembling, not with anger but with fear. "This is private." "Private?" Hank repeated quietly. "Carol, what's in it?" She swallowed hard, looking anywhere but his face. "Sentimental things, old letters, you wouldn't understand." He studied her. The way her knuckles whitened around the handle, the slight tremor in her jaw. She looked less like a woman holding a box of memories and more like someone protecting a secret she couldn't risk losing. Before he could ask anything else, the basement door opened again. Mark appeared at the top of the stairs. When he saw the box in Carol's hands, his face went pale. "Mom," he whispered, voice cracking. He didn't." "It's fine," Carol interrupted sharply. "Let's go upstairs." Mark's eyes darted between them, refusing to settle on Hank for more than a second. He looked stressed, jittery, like his nerves had been exposed. Hank stepped forward. "Mark, what's going on? Why does this box matter?" Mark shook his head, staring at the floor. It's nothing, Dad, just stuff. Mom told you." But his voice betrayed him, strained, uneasy, afraid. Carol grabbed Mark's arm and led him upstairs, the metal box clutched tightly in her other hand. They didn't look back. The basement door closed, leaving Hank alone with the dust and the silence, and a deepening suspicion that whatever was inside that box had absolutely nothing to do with sentimentality. Later that afternoon, Hank stepped outside for fresh air. Judith Miles, his neighbor of nearly 30 years, was tending to her rose bushes. She looked up, studying him with a strange mixture of concern and curiosity. "Hank," she called gently, "is everything all right at night over there?" The question hit him harder than he expected. "Why do you ask?" he said, trying to sound casual. Judith adjusted her gloves. "I've heard movement, voices. It's been going on for weeks. I didn't want to pry, but something feels off." Hank felt a cold ripple move through him. He wasn't imagining things. He wasn't mishearing. Other people, neighbors, had noticed too. Judith gave him a sympathetic smile, but her eyes held worry. "Just checking on you." He nodded, forcing a thin smile. "I appreciate it." As she returned to her roses, Hank stared at his house, its windows calm and still in the afternoon sun. But he knew better. Something was happening inside those walls, something hidden, something whispered, something locked away in a metal box under a tarp. And he was no longer sure he wanted to know the truth. But he knew he couldn't avoid it anymore. Hank hadn't planned on calling Dr. Evelyn Pratt. Therapy had never been part of his life. He was a man who solved problems with his hands, with wrenches and bolts, not conversations. But after 3 nights of whispers, secrets, and a locked metal box being ripped out of his grip, something inside him felt dangerously close to cracking. He needed perspective. Or maybe he needed someone who wasn't living under his roof, someone who didn't look at him with rehearsed softness or jittery avoidance. By late morning he was sitting in Evelyn's office, a quiet room filled with warm lamps and shelves of books that made the space feel grounded, safe. Evelyn sat across from him, legs crossed, notebook resting gently on her knee. She was patient, giving him time to settle before speaking. "What brings you in today, Hank?" Her voice carried no judgment, just a steady invitation to exhale. He didn't start with the box, or the crying, or the way Carol checked his breathing in the middle of the night. Instead, the words came out in fragments. "I'm hearing things, whispers at night, my wife and son talking, every night around the same time." Evelyn leaned forward slightly. Are these new behaviors? New enough, Hank said. At least new to me. He rubbed his palms together, trying to control the tremor. They go silent when I get close. They wait for me to be asleep, and they're hiding things around the house. Hidden objects, conversations cut short, she asked. Hank nodded, staring at a spot on the carpet. Yeah, and they don't want me to know why. Evelyn studied him carefully. Your marriage, how would you describe the emotional connection between you and Carol? Hank hesitated. We're old-fashioned. We don't talk about things the way people do now, but we've always been steady, predictable. I thought that was enough. She nodded. Sometimes long-term routines can disguise emotional distance, but what you're describing, it feels like more than distance. Hank felt a cold ripple move through him. So you think I'm right to be suspicious? I think something is happening in your household, she said gently, and it's affecting you deeply. But suspicion alone can distort a situation if you're not grounded. She paused, considering him. Tell me, Hank, how have you been since retiring? The question hit unexpectedly. He shifted in his seat. I'm trying. Some days are good, others. He let out a slow breath. It's hard not being useful, hard not being needed the way I was before. Maybe I'm not adjusting well. Evelyn's expression softened. Loss of structure can create a lot of uncertainty. It can also make trust feel fragile. Hank's jaw tightened. So you think this is all in my head? No, she said firmly. I think you're noticing things that disturb you, but before you confront your family, I want you to observe. Watch patterns. Listen. Stay grounded in facts. Don't jump to conclusions. She leaned back. You deserve clarity, not conflict driven by fear. Her words settled inside him like warm stones, steady. Not dismissing. He felt his shoulders lower, tension easing just a little. Someone finally understood the weight he'd been carrying. When the session ended, Evelyn walked him to the door. You're not losing control, Hank, she said quietly. You're trying to make sense of a shifting world. That takes strength. He thanked her, stepping outside into the late afternoon light. For the first time in days, he felt a thin thread of calm tugging him forward. Maybe he didn't need to accuse anyone. Maybe watching, waiting, and breathing would bring answers. But the peace lasted barely an hour. When he walked through his front door, he heard hurried movement from the living room. Carol stood near the sofa, a stack of papers in her hands. The moment she saw him, her eyes widened, not surprised to see him, but startled, as if she'd been caught in the middle of something she didn't want him to witness. She fumbled with the papers, sliding them beneath a magazine so fast it looked almost desperate. What are you doing? Hank asked quietly. Carol forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Sorting things, just bills and old notes, nothing important. Her voice was too light, too quick, too polished. Before he could say anything, Mark walked in from the kitchen. His shoulders stiffened when he saw Hank standing near the hidden papers. Dad, Mark said sharply, you really need to stop snooping. The tone, accusatory, defensive, bordering on hostile, hit Hank like a slap. I wasn't snooping, he said. I walked into my own living room. Mark rolled his eyes. Yeah, then why do you look like you're searching for something? Carol placed a hand on Mark's arm, a silent plea for him to calm down, but the damage was done. The calm Hank had carried home from Evelyn's office began dissolving, replaced by something colder and heavier. Suspicion, dread, a terrible certainty that what he'd heard in the night wasn't harmless, wasn't misinterpreted, wasn't a trick of his aging mind. Carol and Mark stood together, too close, too synchronized, with the same guarded expression, the same tightness around the mouth. And Hank felt it again. Whatever they were hiding. It was getting darker. And now, they were no longer pretending he didn't notice. Hank waited until Carol left to visit a friend that afternoon, at least that's what she claimed. Her coat was barely out the door before he felt the pull in his chest again. A whisper of instinct, a quiet order. Look, Something wasn't right, and the tension in the house had grown so thick it felt like it pressed against his ribs. He walked into the master bedroom, a place he had shared with Carol for decades. The comforter was smoothed perfectly across the bed. Her perfume lingered faintly in the air. Everything looked normal, but he knew better than to trust what was on the surface. He moved toward her dresser. For years, that drawer, the top left one, had been her private place. She kept personal papers there, notes, odd trinkets, things she said were just for her. He hesitated, hand hovering, his breath catching. He didn't want to be this man, the one who snooped through his wife's things. But Mark's hostility, the whispers in the night, the hidden box, everything told him he no longer had the luxury of trust. He opened the drawer. At first it looked harmless. A bundle of receipts, an old scarf, faded greeting cards. Then his fingers brushed the edge of an envelope thick with documents. The tab was labeled in Carol's handwriting, insurance. Hank's pulse surged. He pulled the envelope out and spread the contents across the bed. Papers slid out, formal, crisp, covered in dense text. He scanned them with meticulous care, his stomach tightening with every line. The headline froze him. Life insurance policy, benefit amount, $900,000. His name was printed at the top, Henry Dalton. And below it, beneficiary, Carol Dalton. His fingers trembled. The next page showed his signature. Except it wasn't his. The slant was wrong, the loops too smooth, the letters too neat. Hank's real signature bore the slight shake of age, the imprint of decades fixing engines and gripping metal tools. This one belonged to someone younger, someone trying to mimic him. His chest tightened so hard he had to sit on the edge of the bed, papers spread before him like evidence in a courtroom. Why would Carol forge my name? His mind scrambled to make sense of it. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe the insurance agent filled something out wrong. Maybe. Then he saw the date. Policy activation, 3 weeks ago. The exact week Mark moved back home. A chill ran through him so sharply he felt it in his teeth. He whispered to himself, What are you two planning? The timing wasn't coincidence. The whispers weren't coincidence. The checking his breath at night wasn't coincidence. The walls of the room suddenly felt too close, the air too thin. Dark thoughts flickered across his mind, ones he never believed he would associate with his own family. Just then the front door opened. Hank gathered the papers in a shaking hand and stood frozen as Carol's footsteps approached down the hallway. She entered the room casually until she saw what was in his hands. Her entire body went still, her face drained of color. She looked at the documents like they were something dangerous, something that could explode. Hank, she breathed, voice cracking. He held up the signature. Care to explain this? Carol pressed a hand to her mouth, tears swelling instantly, not even trying to hide them. This wasn't the calm, composed Carol he'd always known. This was a woman unraveling. Hank, please, she whispered, stepping toward him. It's not what you think. Not what I think, he barked. The anger felt foreign, too sharp for his usually gentle nature. You forged my name on a $900,000 policy. You're listed as the beneficiary. You activated it the same week Mark came home. And you've been whispering in the middle of the night, checking to see if I'm asleep. What am I supposed to think, Carol? She shook her head rapidly, tears spilling. I didn't want you to find it like this. He took a step back. Like what? Like I'm some kind of burden you're planning to cash in on. Carol sobbed, not dainty crying, not the quiet sniffles he heard in the kitchen days ago. This was guttural, shaking, full-body grief, like she'd been holding something in too long. It's not about the money, she gasped. You have to believe that. Then tell me the truth, Hank snapped. What's been going on? Carol sank onto the edge of the bed, covering her face with her hands. I can't, she whispered through her fingers. Not yet. You'll misunderstand. You'll think the worst. Hank stared at her, feeling the ground tilt beneath him. Her reaction wasn't calculating or cold. It was terrified. For the first time, a new possibility crept in. This wasn't simple greed. This wasn't a scheme for money. Something else, something deeper, more personal, was at play. But that realization did nothing to calm him. In fact, it sharpened the dread in his gut. Because if the betrayal wasn't about money, then whatever they were hiding was far worse. The days that followed the insurance discovery became a kind of silent battleground. Hank barely slept at all now. Every night he lay awake in the dark, listening, waiting for the footsteps, the whispers, the secret conversations. But strangely, the house had gone still. No creaks, no murmurs, no midnight meetings. Carol and Mark seemed to have shut down their nighttime routine the moment they realized Hank had started watching. They were being careful, too careful. During the day, the air in the house felt brittle, as if the wrong word might shatter it. Carol moved around quietly, her footsteps small and cautious. She answered Hank in short phrases, never full sentences, never explanations. Her warmth had evaporated overnight. She didn't argue, she didn't comfort. She didn't try to fix anything. She simply withdrew. Mark, on the other hand, filled the space Carol vacated with a new kind of energy, hostile, sharp-edged. He hovered around Carol as if she needed protection from her own husband. He watched Hank constantly, eyes narrowed, jaw tight, body always angled in that subtle, territorial stance. It was the posture of a guard dog, not a son. One afternoon, when Hank walked into the living room, Mark stood up immediately, blocking the hallway without saying a word. "I'm going to the kitchen," Hank muttered. Mark didn't move, "just making sure you're not snooping again." The accusation hung between them like smoke. Hank clenched his jaw but said nothing. Anything he said would only feed the tension, and he had already learned that logic didn't work here. But the moment that changed everything happened 3 nights later, long after both Carol and Mark had gone to bed. It was almost 2 in the morning. Hank got up quietly, craving a glass of water. As he approached the hallway, a faint mechanical sound reached him, a stuttering hum, then a grind. A shredder. Hank paused, heart kicking against his ribs. He followed the sound to Mark's old bedroom. The door was half shut, a thin bar of light slicing across the floor. He pushed it open gently. Mark was hunched over the small desk, feeding papers through a shredder in quick, frantic motions. Sweat dotted his forehead. Pages were stacked in messy piles, too many to be old homework, too many to be casual clutter. These were documents someone was trying to erase quickly, quietly. Hank stepped inside. "What are you shredding?" Mark jerked, startled, his face flushed. "Don't sneak up on me like that." "I asked you a question," Hank said, voice low. Mark shoved the remaining papers into a drawer. "It's none of your business. Go to bed." Hank looked at the shredder, the bin overflowing with strips of paper. Something inside him, something old and instinctive, whispered that he had just witnessed evidence being destroyed. The next morning, rattled and unsure of what to do, Hank drove to Dr. Evelyn Pratt's office without an appointment. She made time for him, sensing the urgency from the moment he walked in. "They're acting strange," he said, pacing the room. "Carol barely talks to me, and Mark, he watches me like I'm the intruder. Last night I caught him shredding God knows what. They're hiding something, Evelyn, and they know I'm onto them." Evelyn steepled her fingers thoughtfully. "Do you feel safe in your home, Hank?" The question made the room tilt slightly. He sat down. "I don't know." Evelyn leaned forward. "Given the secrecy, the forged signature, and the escalating behavior, I want you to take precautions. Keep your phone with you. Tell a neighbor you trust. And Hank, make sure your physical safety is protected." The words hit him harder than he expected. No one, not even he, had said it out loud until now. Safety. The implication twisted his stomach. Later that afternoon, acting on Evelyn's advice, Hank changed the locks on the exterior doors. He worked quietly, tightening screws, installing new deadbolts. He didn't want a scene, But the moment Carol came home and saw the new locks, she lost whatever restraint she'd been holding onto. "You changed the locks," she shouted, storming toward him, "on your own family." "I'm doing what I need to do," Hank said, trying to stay calm. "How could you do this?" she cried. "What are you afraid of? What do you think we're going to do?" Mark rushed in from the kitchen. "You're out of line, Dad." The tension in the room swelled like a storm cloud ready to burst. Hank looked between them, Carol trembling with anger, Mark glaring with that wild protectiveness, and he felt something inside him fracture. The house, once warm and familiar, now felt dangerous, tight, suffocating. And for the first time, Hank realized something chilling. Whatever was happening here wasn't just confusion or miscommunication. It was escalating, and he was running out of time to understand why. Hank didn't plan to follow Carol. It just happened, an instinct rising from the tension that had been building for weeks. When she left the house that morning with her purse pressed tight against her side and her eyes red from another night of strained silence, something in her demeanor struck him as wrong. Not ordinary errand-running wrong, secretive wrong. She avoided looking at him the entire time she put on her coat, mumbling something about returning library books. But she didn't take the road toward town. From 3 cars back, far enough to stay unseen but close enough not to lose her, Hank watched her turn toward the industrial stretch on the edge of Lexington, the part of town lined with warehouses, auto salvage yards, and storage facilities. Carol never came here. She had no reason to. Yet she pulled into Blue Star Storage, a row of steel doors painted a harsh, unfriendly blue. Hank parked behind a moving truck and watched from a sliver of its shadow. Carol stepped out of the car, looking around nervously, hugging her purse the way someone clings to a secret they can't afford to drop. A minute later, a man walked toward her from behind Unit 47. Hank had never seen him before, mid-50s, worn jacket, posture tense. Carol met him halfway. They didn't shake hands. They didn't greet each other. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out a plain white envelope. The stranger handed her one as well. The exchange took only seconds, but the weight of it hit Hank like cold rain, quiet, sudden, unavoidable. His breath caught in his throat. What was she doing? Who was this man? Why exchange envelopes in a storage facility parking lot? Then they started arguing. Carol's voice was a ragged whisper at first. "We agreed, he can't know yet." The man snapped. "Ed back, you're running out of time." "I need more," she pleaded, "just a little more." "You said that last week." Hank pressed himself deeper into the truck's shadow, heart pounding. He had heard Carol upset before, but this was something different. Fear, desperation, guilt, all tangled together. The stranger shook his head. "If he finds out on his own, it'll be worse." "He won't," Carol insisted, voice breaking. "Not if we handle it the right way." The argument escalated until Carol covered her face with her hands. After a moment, she took a trembling breath, turned away from the man, and walked briskly back to her car. She drove off without looking back, tears streaking down her cheeks. When her taillights disappeared around the corner, Hank waited another 30 seconds, long enough to make sure no one else was watching. Then he walked toward Unit 47, pulse thudding in his ears. The stranger didn't reappear. The row of units lay silent and still. Hank rattled the handle of the metal door. It wasn't fully locked. The man must have rushed out in anger, leaving the latch hanging loose. Hank looked around once, twice, and then lifted the door. Cold, dusty air drifted out. At first glance, the storage unit looked ordinary: stacked boxes, old furniture, a couple of plastic totes. But Hank recognized some of the containers. These were their boxes, ones Carol had claimed were too sentimental to throw away. Why would she move them here? He stepped inside, eyes adjusting quickly. On a small folding table lay a stack of file folders, neatly arranged, carefully labeled. He approached them slowly, dread tightening around his ribs. The top folder was worn, its corners curled as if handled too many times. The label read, Dalton Mark Medical. Hank felt the floor tilt. He opened the folder. Pages filled with clinical notes, physician signatures, evaluations. Words jumped out at him like splinters. Psychiatric history. Episode severity. Dissociation. Risk concerns. Recommended supervision. His hands trembled. He flipped through the next folder, then the next, all with the same name, all cloaked in a medical language designed to soften the truth yet reveal it all at once. His son, quiet, defensive Mark, had a history he knew nothing about. Not a minor issue, not a passing incident, something serious, something Carol had buried, something she had locked away in this storage unit like a piece of their family she hoped would never be seen again. Hank leaned against the metal wall, struggling to process the weight of what he'd uncovered. Every whisper, every secretive look, every late-night conversation now carried a different meaning, one he wasn't prepared for. He whispered into the hollow silence, "Why didn't you tell me?" But no one answered. The unit around him suddenly felt claustrophobic, too small to contain the truth. He backed out, pulling the door down gently until it clicked shut. His hands wouldn't stop shaking as he walked back to his car. Carol's tears. Mark's hostility. The forged signature. The shredded documents. It all pointed to a past, Mark's past, that had been carefully hidden from him. And now Hank understood one chilling thing. The secret wasn't about money. It was about Mark. And whatever he didn't know was far more dangerous than he ever imagined. Hank sat in his truck for nearly 10 minutes before he could bring himself to open the folder again. The storage unit's cold air still clung to his clothes, but it was nothing compared to the chill gripping his chest. He spread the papers across the passenger seat, each document a piece of history he was never allowed to know. The deeper he read, the tighter the silence inside the truck grew. The first file outlined an incident from 11 years ago, psychiatric disturbance following acute stress. The words were clinical, emotionless, but the margins held scribbled notes from a doctor who clearly wasn't trying to sugarcoat anything. Underlined twice was the phrase. Episode included violent dissociation. Hank's breath caught. Violent. Not emotional. Not withdrawn. Violent. He kept reading, his eyes racing over terms that didn't belong anywhere near his son's name. Threat assessment, impulse control failure, supervised care recommendation. The reports painted a picture of Mark that Hank had never seen, of a man who had struggled, suffered, lost control. But instead of being included, instead of being asked for help, he had been removed from the equation entirely. Another document made his hands go numb. Authorization for financial conservatorship. Hank's name was written at the bottom, except it wasn't his handwriting. Another forged signature. This time not for insurance. This time for control over Mark's finances, medical decisions, and long-term treatment. Carol had done it years ago. And Hank had never known. His throat tightened. "My own son," he whispered, voice cracking, "and they kept all of it from me." He closed the folder slowly, as afraid the truth might spill out further. Then he drove straight to Evelyn Pratt's office, walking in without calling ahead. Her receptionist looked startled, but Evelyn stepped out within seconds, reading the urgency etched across his face. In her office, Hank spread the files across the small coffee table. The pages fanned out like the aftermath of a storm. Evelyn didn't touch them at first. She simply scanned the top lines, her expression shifting gradually from curiosity to concern to something colder. "This is significant," she murmured. "I didn't know any of it," Hank said. His voice sounded different to his own ears, strained, older. "Not a single word. Carol kept everything secret. Years of this. Years." Evelyn picked up the report with the underlined phrase. "Violent dissociation isn't a casual diagnosis," she said gently. "This suggests Mark had episodes where he wasn't fully aware of his actions." Hank swallowed hard. Was he dangerous? "Not necessarily," she said carefully. "But without the right support systems in place, without transparency, secrecy can escalate risks." She tapped one page lightly. "And forging your name for conservatorship. That means Carol took full responsibility for Mark's care. Alone." "Why," Hank whispered, "why cut me out?" Evelyn shifted in her chair. "Some spouses overmanage crises. They think they're protecting their partner from worry or from difficult decisions, but in doing so they isolate themselves and everyone else." Her eyes softened. "But this level of secrecy, combined with Mark's history and recent behavior, Hank, this isn't healthy for any of you." Hank leaned back, hands clasped tightly. "He's been watching me, acting hostile, shredding papers, and now this." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Your instincts are telling you something important, and you need to listen. If Mark is under emotional strain, if he feels threatened, or if he senses something slipping out of his control, situations like that can become unpredictable. You must protect yourself." The words hit him like a physical blow. Protect himself. The idea felt wrong backward. A father shouldn't have to guard himself from his own child, but the documents in front of him said otherwise. "What do I do?" Hank asked quietly. Evelyn folded her hands. "Stay observant, stay calm. Don't confront either of them directly about this. Not yet. You don't know their emotional states. You don't know what they might do under pressure." She paused. "You need time and safety to think clearly." Hank absorbed that, the weight of it settling heavily on his shoulders. He nodded slowly, decisively. "Then that's what I'll do. I'll protect myself. Quietly." When he left Evelyn's office, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. He walked toward his truck feeling older than his 70 years, like a man who had lived two different lives, and was suddenly seeing the truth in both. His mind replayed the whispers in the night. Carol's tears, Mark's hostility, the forged signatures, the storage unit, and now the medical files, evidence of a past carefully hidden, a truth buried so deeply he hadn't even known to search for it. As he started the engine, one realization carved itself into the quiet. He wasn't just living in a house full of secrets. He was living with two people who might do anything to keep those secrets buried. And now that he knew the truth, they couldn't afford for him to learn anything more. Hank had spent the entire morning replaying the conversation with Evelyn in his mind, her warning, her concern, the quiet seriousness in her voice. By afternoon, a plan had formed, not out of paranoia but out of necessity. If Carol and Mark were hiding something this enormous, medical files, insurance policies, forged signatures, then he needed proof, not guesses, not suspicions, evidence. So he went to the hardware store and bought a small digital recorder. It fit in his palm, barely noticeable. When he returned home, the house was empty. Carol and Mark had gone shopping together, which only added a new layer of unease. They never did errands as a pair unless something was wrong. Hank stood in the upstairs hallway, holding the recorder, thumb hovering over the power button. If they weren't going to tell him the truth, then he would let the truth reveal itself another way. He switched the device on and slid it behind the decorative basket near the hallway table, close enough to catch the late-night whispers that had haunted him for weeks, hidden enough not to be discovered. As evening settled, an unusual tension filled the house. Carol barely looked at him. Mark didn't say a word beyond a stiff nod. Dinner passed in silence, every clink of a fork sounding louder than it should. The air felt thick, waiting. By 10, Hank retreated to the bedroom, pretending to be exhausted. He lay still for over an hour, listening as the house quieted, then shifted. Soft movement, a murmur, the first hint that the HTLY ritual had returned. He didn't move, didn't risk exposing himself. Instead, he kept breathing slow and steady, eyes closed, listening to the familiar cadence of whispers drifting down the hall. But he didn't strain to hear it all. The recorder would do that for him. Only once he was certain they had gone back to bed did he slip silently into the hallway, retrieve the device, and return to the bedroom. His hands shook as he powered it off, as if the small rectangle of plastic suddenly weighed the same as the truth he feared. He sat on the edge of the bed, hit play, and listened. At first, the recording captured Russell's footsteps, a sigh. Then voices emerged, strained and sharp with panic. Carol's voice came first, trembling. "We can't hide this anymore." Hank felt his pulse spike. Her tone was nothing like the cold restraint she'd been using with him. This was raw. Mark answered, his voice edged with desperation. "Dad can't handle it." The words punched Hank in the chest. Handle what? More shuffling, someone pacing. Possibly Mark, the weight of his steps heavier, quicker. Carol spoke again, softer this time but no less urgent. "You saw him today. He's getting worse." Mark's breath hitched audibly. "And what happens when he finds out? What then? He'll fall apart." Hank leaned closer to the recorder, every muscle in his body tight as a pulled wire. Then came the line that stopped his heart. Carol whispered, barely audible. "He's dying, Mark. He deserves the truth." Hank's whole body went cold. "Dying." He froze, staring at nothing, the words echoing in his skull. He replayed the sentence again, and again, and again, each time the same soft, devastating whisper. "He's dying, Mark." He dragged a shaking hand over his mouth. He felt no pain, no symptoms beyond the usual aches of age. Evelyn had said nothing that suggested he was sick. No doctor had. No test results had gone missing. Nothing made sense. Dying. Could he be dying without knowing? Had someone been keeping his medical information from him the same way they had kept Mark's? His mind raced through every unexplained moment. The late-night conversations, the insurance policy, Carol checking his breathing, Mark's fierce protectiveness, the secrecy humming beneath every interaction. But the recording wasn't finished. Mark's voice returned, thinner, almost fragile. "We should tell him, soon, before he thinks." The sentence cut off, replaced by footsteps and a sudden spike of noise, perhaps someone turning sharply. Carol's voice followed, trembling with grief. "Just not yet. I don't want him scared. I don't want him feeling alienated. When the doctor confirms." The audio clipped out briefly, as if someone stepped too close to the recorder. Then Carol, barely a whisper. "He deserves the truth, but I'm not ready to break him." Hank pressed pause, heart thudding violently. Break him? What truth could break a 70-year-old man more than hearing he was supposedly dying? He rewound the recording and listened again. Every inflection, every breath, every pained whisper. The words never changed. By the eighth replay, Hank's shock had transformed into something heavier, a mixture of dread and suffocating confusion. If he was truly dying, why didn't he know? And if he wasn't dying, then why would Carol say he was? He stared at the dark room around him, breathing shallow and uneven. He didn't know what frightened him more. That he was dying, or that Carol and Mark wanted him to believe he was. Either way, the truth was closing in, and he could feel it, a shadow stretching toward him, slow and deliberate. And now he needed to know what truth they were planning to reveal, before they revealed it on their terms. Hank didn't sleep at all. The words from the recording looped in his mind until dawn scraped across the windows. "He's dying, Mark. He deserves the truth." By morning, he wasn't sure if he was numb or shaking. Either way, the fear had settled into his bones like cold water. Carol found him sitting at the kitchen table, untouched coffee in front of him, the lines around his eyes deeper, more exhausted than she'd ever seen. She paused in the doorway, as if sensing something irreversible had arrived between them. "Hank," she whispered. He didn't answer. He just looked at her, really looked at her. The woman he had loved for decades, raised a family with, built a life with, and yet he suddenly felt like he barely knew her. Carol stepped closer. "You're scaring me. What's wrong?" Her voice trembled, and for once he didn't soften. He pulled the recorder from his pocket and slid it across the table. "I heard you," he said quietly, "last night." Color drained from her face. "Hank, you listened." "I couldn't sleep," he said, "not with everything happening behind my back." His voice cracked. "Tell me the truth, Carol, am I dying?" Her breath caught. Her hand went to her chest the way it did when she braced for pain. She sat down slowly, eyes glistening. "Oh, Hank, no, no, you're not dying." He let out a sound that was half relief, half broken disbelief. "Then why would you say that? Why would you tell Mark that?" She closed her eyes, and for a long moment she seemed to crumble, shoulders sagging, mouth trembling, tears threatening. When she finally opened her eyes, the truth inside them was raw, unguarded. "Hank," she said softly, you have early-stage dementia." The world tilted. A hollow silence filled his ears. Carol continued cautiously, as if every word might shatter him. "The doctor told me 3 months ago, mild cognitive impairment with a high chance of progression. He said we should prepare early." She swallowed. "I didn't want to burden you until we knew more." Hank stared at her, unable to breathe. Dementia. He searched his memory, missed names, misplaced tools, the times he walked into a room and forgot why. He had blah. Med retirement, age, stress. He felt his throat tighten. "Why didn't you tell me?" Carol reached for his hand, but he pulled away. She flinched but didn't stop. "Because I didn't want you to panic. I didn't want you obsessing over every slip or forgetting. I wanted time to figure out how to take care of you, how to protect you." Her voice cracked. "You've been so proud your whole life. I didn't want you feeling broken." Hank felt a tear slip down his cheek. He didn't even wipe it away. "And the nighttime whispers." "We were planning," she said gently. "Talking about how to manage things, how to make the transition easier when you needed more help. I didn't want you overhearing bits and thinking we were doing something behind your back." "But you were," he whispered. "You were doing everything behind my back." Carol flinched again. "Because you weren't ready, Hank." He shut his eyes as another wave of grief hit him. "And the insurance policy, $900,000. Carol exhaled slowly. "That was for long-term care. Assisted living, home nursing, things insurance doesn't cover. I didn't want you worrying about being a burden. I was trying to prepare." She hesitated. "And the signature, that was Mark." Hank looked up sharply. "He forged my name." "Yes," she whispered. "He panicked. You weren't answering your phone that day, and the agent said it needed to be filed immediately or the rate would change. He thought he was helping. I should have stopped him. I didn't. And I'm sorry." Hank stood abruptly, pacing, gripping the counter for balance. Everything he thought he'd known, every suspicion, every moment of fear, twisted painfully inside him. "So all this time I thought you were plotting something. I thought you were hiding something dangerous. I thought," his voice broke, "I thought you wanted me gone." Carol's tears spilled freely now. "Hank, no, never. I was trying to protect you. I handled it badly, I know that, but I love you. I've loved you my whole life. I didn't want you carrying this alone." He covered his face with both hands as grief, shame, and exhaustion collided inside him. The betrayal felt enormous, but so did the love underneath it. A love that had been misguided, secretive, clumsy, but real. When he finally lowered his hands, his voice was barely a whisper. "You should have trusted me." "I know," she said, "and I'm so sorry." Hank sank into a chair, the weight of the diagnosis settling slowly, painfully. Dementia. The word echoed through him like a bell toll, his mind, his memories, his independence, slipping. But as he looked at Carol, her trembling hands, her swollen eyes, her desperate sincerity, another feeling cut through the fog rising inside him. Guilt. Because everything he suspected, everything he feared had been wrong. He had been fighting shadows when the real threat was inside his own body. Carol reached for his hand again. This time, after a long moment, Hank let her take it. But the ache didn't fade, because knowing the truth didn't make it easier. It only made the future feel heavier, and far more uncertain than before. The kitchen felt smaller the next morning, as if the walls had absorbed every secret that had been spilled the night before. Hank sat at the table, staring at the steam rising from his coffee, trying to hold on to something, anything, that felt steady. But nothing did. Carol moved quietly around the room, offering him small, fragile glances that dissolved the moment he looked up. The diagnosis hung between them like a fog neither knew how to walk through. Mark appeared in the doorway, shoulders hunched, eyes shadowed. He stood there a moment, rubbing the back of his neck, then finally spoke. "Dad," he said softly, "I moved back home to help. That's why I came when I did." His voice cracked. "Not to take over, not to control anything. I knew you were struggling and Mom was scared handling it alone." Hank's jaw clenched. He wanted to believe him. He wanted to see only concern in Mark's face, not the secrecy, the shredding, the guarded hostility. "You should have told me," Hank murmured. Mark shifted uncomfortably. "Mom didn't want to tell you until everything was confirmed. I was just trying to support her." "By forging my signature on an insurance policy?" Hank asked sharply. Mark looked away, guilt flashing across his face. "I messed up. I panicked. I shouldn't have done that, but I wasn't trying to hurt you." Words like help, protect, support, they all sounded like excuses to Hank now. He wasn't a child. He wasn't helpless. But in their eyes, he suddenly felt like both. A hollow feeling spread through his chest. "Do you all think I'm incapable already?" he whispered. "That I can't make decisions, that I'm slipping?" Carol stepped closer, tears swelling again. "Hank, no. Then why keep everything from me?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough hurt to stop her mid-step. The room went silent. Later that afternoon, Hank returned to Dr. Evelyn Pratt's office. Needing space to breathe, needing someone who wasn't part of the web of secrets closing in around him. She greeted him gently, her expression already soft with concern. "How are you holding up?" she asked. He sank onto the couch, feeling the fatigue of years settle into his bones. "I don't know," he said. "I feel betrayed, infantilized, like everyone decided who I am without asking me." Evelyn nodded slowly. "That's a very real kind of grief, Hank, the loss of autonomy, even the perception of it." He looked up, eyes damp. "Carol said I have early-stage dementia, that I'm declining, but I don't feel that far gone." Evelyn leaned forward. "Have you seen the neurologist's full report?" "No." Her brow tightened. "Then you're entitled to know. You deserve clarity, not second-hand interpretation, not emotional assumptions." Her words grounded him. For the first time since the diagnosis was revealed, Hank felt a spark of determination push through the fog. "I want a second evaluation," he said. "I think that's wise," she replied. "Regardless of what it reveals, you need to understand your own condition, not through fear and not through someone else's protective instincts." That afternoon, he scheduled an appointment with a neurologist across town, Dr. Keller, a methodical man with a calm voice and sharp eyes. Carol offered to go with him, but Hank refused. He needed this alone. Dr. Keller ran memory tests, attention assessments, motor evaluations, blood work. It took nearly 2 hours, and when it was over, the doctor folded his hands and spoke with careful precision. "Hank," he said, "you do show signs of mild cognitive impairment. It may or may not progress, but you do not have dementia, not at this stage." Hank blinked. "Not dementia." "No," Dr. Keller repeated firmly. "Your memory retention is slightly below average for your age, but well within functioning limits. You will need routine monitoring, yes, but you are not in immediate decline." Relief washed over Hank like a warm tide, then twisted sharply into something colder. If this was the truth, then Carol and Mark, the people he trusted most, had exaggerated his condition. They had talked about him as if he were dying. They had planned care like he was slipping away. They had made decisions for him, not with him. His pulse thudded against his ribs. "They didn't tell me this," he whispered. "I'm sorry to hear that," Dr. Keller said quietly. "But now you know, and this is your life to steer." Hank drove home in silence, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. Mild cognitive impairment, not dementia, not dying, not losing himself. He walked into the house where Carol and Mark stood waiting, anxiety written all over their faces. Carol stepped forward. "How did it go?" Hank met her eyes, really met them. And for the first time in weeks, he felt the truth surge up inside him like something uncontainable. "You made me think I was disappearing," he said, voice trembling. "But the doctor says I'm not. You let me believe the worst." Carol's lips parted, eyes widening in alarm. "Hank, we didn't mean." But he held up a hand. This wasn't about meaning. This was about trust. And something inside him had just snapped clean in two. He wasn't dying. He wasn't disappearing. But something in their family was. And now, for the first time, Hank felt a new certainty rising through the heartbreak. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a turning point. Hank woke the next morning with a clarity he hadn't felt in weeks. The grief, the betrayal, the shock, they were still there, packed tight beneath his ribs. But something else had risen above them. Resolve. Quiet, steady, unmistakable. If Carol and Mark had built a world of secrets around him, then he would build something of his own: truth, protection, and control. He waited until both of them left the house, Carol claiming she needed groceries, Mark heading out for a walk. The moment the door clicked shut, Hank grabbed his keys and drove to the one person he knew would tell him exactly what he needed to hear without sugarcoating a single word. Attorney Wallace Boone. Boone's office sat above a hardware store downtown, the kind of place filled with leather chairs and shelves of old casebooks. Boone greeted him with his usual calm, firm handshake, though Hank could see the question forming in his eyes. "You look troubled, Hank. What's going on?" Hank sat down heavily. "I need to make some changes," he said, quietly. Boone listened without interrupting as Hank unfolded the last month. Every whisper, every forged signature, every hidden document, every truth revealed too late. When Hank finished, Boone leaned back in his chair and exhaled. "You did the right thing coming to me," he said. "Let's start with the insurance policy." Hank nodded. "I want it revoked completely." Boone opened a folder. "Given the forged signature, that won't be a problem. The company will void it immediately once they verify your actual handwriting." He paused. "Are you sure you want it gone? It was meant for your care." Hank's jaw tightened. "If I ever need care, I'll decide how to pay for it. Not them, not behind my back." "Understood." Within 20 minutes, Boone had filed the revocation notice digitally and scheduled a follow-up meeting to finalize it. But Hank wasn't finished. "I need to update my will," he said. Temporarily remove Carol and Mark." Boone didn't blink. "Given the circumstances, that's reasonable." "It's not revenge," Hank said quietly. I need space. I need time. They've been making decisions as if I'm already gone." Boone nodded. "Who do you want listed as interim beneficiary?" Hank sighed. "My brother Tom, just until I sort this out." They drafted the update, signed the papers, and Boone slid them into a sealed envelope. "And one more thing," Hank said. "The house. I want it protected legally so no one can sell it, mortgage it, or make changes without my consent." Boone raised an eyebrow, expecting pushback. "Expecting paranoia," Hank said. He wasn't sure whose, Mark's or his own. Boone filed the house protection order. It would require Hank's signature, and only Hank's, for any future legal action related to it. When the meeting was done, Hank stepped out into the sunlight feeling strangely lighter. Not healed, not safe, but anchored. For the first time since everything began, he had control over something again. By the time he got home, late afternoon light was stretching across the yard. Carol was sitting at the kitchen table, anxiously twisting her hands. She looked up immediately. "You were gone a long time," she said softly. "Where did you go?" Hank opened the fridge, pretending to look for something. "Just out." Her eyes followed him, searching, worried. "You've been distant since yesterday." He didn't respond. He couldn't, not without letting anger take over, and anger wouldn't help him now. Mark appeared in the doorway a moment later, shoulders tight, eyes narrowed. "Dad, are you planning something?" Hank turned, forcing his expression to stay neutral. "Why would you ask that?" Mark shrugged, but his jaw worked anxiously. "You're different today, quiet, focused, I can feel it." Carol shot her son a warning look, but Mark's paranoia only sharpened. You're not trying to punish us, are you?" Hank met his gaze evenly. "I'm just thinking." He walked past them both, heading toward the living room, leaving them standing there. Carol worried, Mark suspicious. Inside, Hank sat down in his old recliner, the one that had molded perfectly to his frame after years of use. He stared at the muted television, not really watching, letting the silence settle over him like armor. His house was no longer a battlefield tonight. Because for the first time, he had made his move. The documents were filed. The protections were in place. The insurance was gone. His will was changed. They didn't know it yet. They didn't know anything. And Hank planned to keep it that way, for now. He relaxed back in the chair, breathing slow and steady, preparing himself. Because the next move would come from them. Hank woke the next morning feeling the weight of every legal step he'd taken. The house seemed unusually quiet, too still, as if it sensed the shift in power. When he walked into the kitchen, Carol was already there, arms folded tightly across her chest, eyes swollen from what looked like a sleepless night. "Hank," she said sharply, not even waiting for him to sit, "we need to talk." He poured himself a cup of coffee without looking at her. "About what?" Carol stepped closer, her voice rising with controlled panic. "About this distance. This cold shoulder, you're overreacting. I did what I thought was best. We did." He finally met her eyes, hurt, wounded, guarded. "Overreacting," he repeated slowly. "Carol, you took away my right to know my own condition. You made choices about my future without including me. You kept everything in the dark so I would panic." She flinched at the word. "Because I love you, because I was scared of losing you." "And I was scared of losing myself," he said quietly. Before Carol could respond, Mark stormed into the kitchen, tension radiating off him like heat. "What's going on?" he demanded. "Mom said you're blaming her again." Hank set his mug down carefully. He'd rehearsed this conversation in his mind all night, but now that it was here, every word felt heavier. "I'm not blaming her. I'm explaining why I feel betrayed." Mark laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Betrayed, Dad, we've been protecting you." Hank straightened. "From what? The truth, my own agency, my own decisions. I'm not a child." Mark stepped forward, shoulders squared, voice laced with anger. "You don't understand how hard this has been for Mom. She's been carrying everything alone." "That was her choice," Hank replied calmly, "but she didn't get to make choices for me." Carol's voice cracked. "I wasn't trying to control you. I was trying to save you from pain." "You caused more," Hank said, "much more." Mark's jaw clenched. "You're twisting everything. We did what we had to. You weren't stable. You were forgetting things. You needed us." Hank looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something he hadn't allowed himself to fully acknowledge: fear. Mark was terrified, terrified of losing control, of losing the carefully constructed reality he and Carol had built. "I needed honesty," Hank said softly. "Not secrets, not forged signatures, not midnight whispers about how I'm dying." Carol gasped, covering her mouth. "Hank, I was scared." So was I, he said, voice tight, for weeks. Mark stepped between them protectively. Dad, stop pushing her. Stop acting like we're villains. Hank's patience cracked, but not with anger, with sorrow. I never asked for heroes, I asked for the truth, and you took it away from me. Carol sank into a chair, shaking her head in disbelief. We were doing everything for you. No, Hank said. You were doing everything around me. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mark finally broke it, his voice rising. So what? You hate us now, is that it? After everything we've done? I don't hate you, Hank replied, but I need space. The words hit the room like a hammer. Carol looked up sharply, eyes wide. Space. Hank nodded. Time, distance, clarity. I can't think in a house full of secrets. I can't breathe in a place where everyone knows more about my life than I do. Mark's face twisted with disbelief. After all we've done, he pointed at Carol, voice cracking. She cried every night worrying about you. I worried every night too, Hank said. Alone. Mark slammed his fist on the counter. We did everything for you. Hank stared at him, unflinching. Then maybe you should have talked to me instead of planning my future in whispers. Carol stood, reaching for him. Hank, please don't do this, don't leave. But the decision had settled in him like a stone dropped into deep water. Heavy, irreversible. I'm not leaving forever, he said softly. I'm leaving so I can breathe. He grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door. Carol and Mark stood frozen, Carol pleading through trembling lips, Mark glaring with an anger born of fear. Hank opened the door. The cold air rushed in, brushing against his face like a kind of freedom he hadn't felt in weeks. Hank, Carol whispered, voice breaking, please don't walk away. He looked back once, just once, and the sight was enough to carve itself into his memory. Carol collapsed into Mark's arms, sobbing, her whole body shaking with grief. Mark wrapped his arms around her, but his face stayed locked on Hank, burning with betrayal and panic, as if he just lost control of something he'd been holding together by sheer will. Hank stepped outside and closed the door behind him quietly. Not with anger, not with finality, but with the crushing recognition that love wasn't the problem. Control was. And now the truth was out in the open, raw and painful, and nothing in that house would ever be the same again. The rental house was small, barely 800 square feet, tucked behind a line of aging maple trees on the quieter edge of Lexington. The walls were thin, the floorboards uneven, and the heater rattled every time it kicked on, but to Hank it felt like the first breath of air he'd taken in weeks. No whispers, no secrets. No eyes watching him from across the room, gauging his stability, measuring his sanity. Just silence, just space. He kept his phone on the kitchen counter, face down, volume off. It buzzed constantly, sometimes 10 times an hour, all from Carol. The first few voicemails were pleading. Hank, please pick up. We can talk about this. You don't have to do this alone. Then came the anxious ones. I don't know where you went. Why are you shutting us out? What did Evelyn tell you? And finally the broken ones, just sobs, her breath trembling, her voice small and frightened. Hank listened to a few, but not all. Each one cut him in a way he wasn't ready to process. He loved her, but he was finally beginning to understand that love couldn't undo the damage done by secrecy. On the third morning, his phone buzzed with a different name. Attorney Boone. Hank answered immediately. Wallace. Boone's voice was steady but edged with urgency. Hank, I intercepted something this morning. You need to hear it directly from me before it blindsides you. Hank braced himself. What is it? Boone exhaled. Mark just filed a petition for partial guardianship over you. The room seemed to tilt. Guardianship for me. Yes. He listed cognitive decline, susceptibility to confusion, and Boone paused, disgust clear in his voice, inability to manage personal affairs without emotional distress. He signed the affidavit yesterday afternoon. Hank gripped the back of the kitchen chair to steady himself. He didn't talk to me. He never even mentioned. I know, Boone said. He didn't legally have to notify you until the petition was reviewed, but I flagged it the moment it hit the system. I filed an immediate objection on your behalf. Hank closed his eyes, fighting the sting behind them. He thinks I can't make decisions for myself. He's trying to force control where he's not entitled to it, Boone said. You have tea. He right to contest it, and you will. A long silence stretched between them. When Hank finally spoke, his voice was low. I need to go back to the house. There are documents I need. Medical records, financial logs, proof that I'm still capable. Boone hesitated. Do you want me to come with you? No, Hank said. I'll handle it. After they ended the call, Hank stood in the middle of the tiny living room, feeling a shift deep in his chest. This wasn't fear anymore. It wasn't confusion or heartbreak. It was resolve. He drove back to the farmhouse that afternoon. The driveway felt narrower than he remembered, the house looming with a weight he couldn't quite name. He stepped inside quietly. He still had his key, and found Carol sitting on the living room couch, hands clasped tightly in her lap, as if she'd been waiting hours for him to appear. Her eyes widened. Hank, thank God, where have you been? I've been calling. I know, he said evenly. I'm here to get some documents, that's all. Carol stood quickly, panic rising. Documents? For what? Hank, please talk to me. Don't shut me out like this. Before he could respond, footsteps thudded in the hallway. Mark appeared, jaw clenched, shoulders squared, like he'd been preparing for war. So you finally came back, Mark said, crossing his arms. Good, we need to talk. Hank's eyes narrowed. Do we? Mark took a step forward. You're making reckless choices. The insurance, the will, the house protections, we know. Mom checked the mail. You're acting irrationally, Dad. Carol looked horrified. Mark, stop. No, Mark snapped. He needs to hear this. His stare locked onto Hank, hard and unblinking. I filed for guardianship because you're not well. You can barely manage your emotions. You're confused. You're making dangerous decisions that impact the whole family. Hank felt something inside him ignite, a slow, simmering fire that had been building since the whispers began weeks ago. Dangerous decisions, he echoed. You forged my name on legal documents. You hid your own medical history. And now you want the court to decide whether I can live my own life. Mark stepped even closer, voice rising. We're doing what needs to be done. No, Hank said, his voice cutting clean through the tension, steady as stone. You're doing what lets you stay in control. Carol reached for Mark's arm, desperate. Stop, please stop. But Mark didn't, his face reddened, eyes flashing. Dad, you're acting like we're enemies. Hank took a breath, slow, deliberate. Then he spoke the line he had carried like a blade the entire drive over. You don't get to own my future. Mark froze. Carol's breath hitched. The house fell into a silence thick enough to choke on. Hank stepped past both of them, calm and steady, heading toward the office to retrieve the documents he came for. Behind him, he heard Carol break, her sobs sharp and sudden, as she collapsed into the couch. But Hank didn't turn around. Some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. The courthouse in downtown Lexington always smelled faintly of old paper and cold air, sterile, echoing, heavy with the weight of other people's secrets. Hank sat beside Attorney Boone at the long wooden table, hands clasped together so tightly the knuckles had gone white. Across the room, Mark sat with his own attorney, shoulders hunched, eyes darting between the judge, the door, and the floor. Carol sat behind him, stiff and pale, wringing a tissue until it tore. This was supposed to be a simple hearing. Boone had objected to the guardianship petition, and now the judge would evaluate both sides. But there was something different in Boone today, a quiet intensity, a certainty Hank hadn't seen before. Boone had been digging, and he'd found something. Something big. The judge entered, the room rose, and the proceedings began. "Mr. Boone," the judge said, "you requested an evidentiary hearing." Boone stood. "Yes, Your Honor. My client, Mr. Hank Dalton, is fully competent and stable. The guardianship petition filed by his son, Mark Dalton, contains misleading information and significant omissions." Mark shifted in his seat. Carol touched his shoulder gently, as if urging him to stay calm. Boone reached into his briefcase. "Your Honor, my office obtained financial records that shed a very different light on Mr. Mark Dalton's motivations." Mark's attorney stood quickly. "Objection." "Overruled," the judge said. "Proceed, Mr. Boone." Hank felt his heartbeat thudding beneath his ribs. Boone looked at him once, just briefly, before turning back to the judge. "For months," Boone began, "the narrative has been that Mark moved in with his parents out of concern for his father's health. But the documents we uncovered tell another story." He laid a thick folder on the table. "Medical debt," Boone said. $78,000 of it." Carol gasped softly. Mark's head jerked up. Boone opened the folder, revealing page after page of hospital billing records. "These bills belong to Mr. Mark Dalton, accumulated over the last 2 years, sent to collections, under threat of litigation. None of this was disclosed to his parents, not once." The judge raised her brows. "Mr. Dalton, is this accurate?" Mark's jaw clenched. He didn't answer. Boone continued, voice firm. "The timing is important, Your Honor. 3 weeks after the final collection notice was issued, Mark moved into his parents' home, and 2 days after that, an application for a $900,000 life insurance policy was filed under Hank Dalton's name, a policy that conveniently listed his mother Carol as the sole beneficiary." Carol's eyes widened. "Mark, what is he talking about?" Boone lifted another document. "This is the insurance application. The signature marked as Hank Dalton's has already been confirmed by a handwriting expert to be forged. But what my client did not know, what Mrs. Dalton did not know, was that Section 4, the Financial Beneficiary Amendment, was also forged." Carol covered her mouth. "What?" Boone nodded. "Yes, Mrs. Dalton. Mark submitted that page without your review. You provided the base paperwork, but he altered the amounts and the urgency markers." The room shifted, an invisible ripple of shock passing through everyone. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Dalton, is this true?" Mark inhaled sharply, his chest rising like he was about to defend himself. But then something inside him simply collapsed. His shoulders slumped. His mouth trembled. And suddenly, the man who had been posturing for weeks looked like someone completely unmoored. "I didn't mean to," he whispered. "I didn't mean for it to get this far." Carol stared at him, breath shaking. "Mark, tell me the truth, all of it." Mark squeezed his eyes shut, tears slipping out. "I was drowning," he said. "The bills, the collectors, the phone calls. I couldn't keep up. They were threatening to sue, to take my car, to garnish my wages. I didn't know what else to do." Hank watched frozen as his son unraveled. "I figured if Mom had control of Dad's finances, we could fix things, just until I got back on my feet." His voice broke. "I wasn't trying to hurt him, I swear. I thought it could be temporary." Carol flinched as if struck. "You used me," she whispered. "You used your father's condition. You used my fear. You made me believe you were helping." Mark sobbed harder. "I didn't want to lie to you. I panicked." Boone's voice softened only slightly. "Your Honor, this wasn't about protection. It was about access. Financial access motivated by personal debt." The judge nodded gravely. "It appears the guardianship petition was filed under false pretenses." Carol stared at her son like she no longer recognized him. "You forged your father's name. You forged my paperwork. You made me think I was failing him." Mark's attorney whispered something urgently, but Mark didn't respond. He had fallen quiet, staring at the floor, his shoulders shaking. Hank sat still, numb, every part of him hollow. He wanted to be angry, but what he felt was something heavier. A bone-deep sadness that settled into his chest like stone. The judge cleared her throat. Effective immediately, the court is suspending Mark Dalton's access to all financial decision-making involving Henry Dalton. Furthermore, the guardianship petition is denied in full. Mr. Hank Dalton retains complete autonomy. Boone placed a gentle hand on Hank's arm. Hank didn't move. Carol wiped her tears with trembling fingers, her voice barely a breath. "Mark, how could you?" Mark didn't answer. Hank watched silently, his heart breaking, not from betrayal alone, but from the terrible realization that his son hadn't been protecting him. His son had been drowning in silence, weaponizing loyalty out of desperation. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, shuffling papers, murmured reactions, but Hank heard none of it. He just sat there, still and hollow, watching the pieces of his family fall apart in front of him, and knowing nothing would ever be the same again. The drive back to the rental house after the court hearing felt longer than it should have. The sun was setting behind Hank, washing the sky in orange and pale pink, but none of it touched him. His hands rested motionless on the steering wheel even after he parked, gripped by exhaustion, disappointment, and a quiet ache he couldn't name. He witnessed his son crumble in front of a judge, watched his wife realize she had been manipulated, and felt his own heart bruise as the truth settled like dust around him. The next morning, someone knocked softly on the rental door. Hank recognized the rhythm instantly, gentle, hesitant. Carol. He opened the door, and the look on her face nearly broke him. Her eyes were swollen from crying, shoulders small, as if the weight of the last few months had finally crushed her. "Hank," she whispered, "can I come in?" He moved aside. She stepped into the tiny living room, glancing around as if seeing the life he'd built away from her, simple, sparse, lonely. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence was heavy, not angry, just tired. Carol finally sat at the edge of the couch and folded her hands. "I owe you an apology, a real one, not excuses, not explanations." Hank sat across from her, hands resting on his knees. She took a shaky breath. "I failed you. I let fear guide me instead of trust. I thought keeping things from you was protection, but it was control." Tears gathered in her eyes. "And I let Mark pull me into decisions without questioning him. I should have seen what he was doing. I should have stopped him. I should have told you the truth." Her voice cracked. "I hurt you, I hurt our marriage, and I am so sorry." The sincerity in her voice pulled at something deep inside Hank, something still wounded but no longer bleeding. He let the silence sit between them for several seconds before speaking. "I know you thought you were helping," he said softly, "but you took away my right to understand my own life. You treated me like I was fading when I was." Carol nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I know, I see it now." "And Mark," Hank paused, pain flickering across his face. "What he did wasn't a mistake, it was deliberate." Carol lowered her gaze. "I know, and that's something he has to face on his own." Forgiveness came slowly, like a door opening inch by inch. He wasn't ready to forget everything, not yet. But as he watched Carol cry, saw the guilt shaping her posture, her voice, her breath, he realized she wasn't the enemy. She had been misguided, blinded by fear and maternal instinct, but she hadn't acted out of selfishness. "I forgive you," he said quietly. Carol sobbed softly, covering her mouth with both hands. "But I'm not ready to forgive Mark," Hank continued. "Not yet." Carol nodded, accepting the boundary without protest. "He knows that. He's starting mandatory counseling next week. The judge ordered it after the breakdown." Hank breathed deeply, letting the words settle. Counseling. Maybe it would help Mark, maybe not, but at least it was a start. Later that afternoon, Hank and Carol drove together to see Dr. Evelyn Pratt. Evelyn welcomed them both with her calm, steady presence, offering a space neither of them had felt in months, neutral ground. She guided them gently through the tangled emotions they'd been carrying, helping them speak honestly without collapsing under the weight of guilt or anger. "Hank," Evelyn asked softly, "what do you need from Carol moving forward?" He thought for a long moment. "Honesty, not protection disguised as kindness. I need to be part of decisions about my own life." Carol squeezed her hands in her lap. "I can do that, I will." "And Carol," Evelyn continued, turning toward her, "what do you need from Hank?" Carol's voice trembled. "Patience, and a chance to rebuild the trust I broke." Evelyn nodded. "Both of you will need boundaries and both of you will need grace. But at least now you're communicating from truth, not fear." Over the next few weeks, Hank learned to manage his mild cognitive impairment the way Dr. Keller had recommended. He developed small routines, lists, reminders, journaling. Carol supported him but without smothering. She asked before helping, offered without insisting. Their marriage began to find its footing again, not perfect, not healed, but anchored in transparency. Meanwhile, Mark attended counseling sessions mandated by the court. Reports sent to the family indicated he was cooperating, confronting his debt, exploring the root of his panic-driven behavior. Hank read the reports quietly, without comment. Forgiveness would come on its own timeline, not under pressure. Eventually, after several weeks of distance, support, and conversations that stretched late into the night, Hank made a decision. He would go home. The day he returned, the farmhouse felt different, as if the walls themselves were relieved. The tension that once lived in every corner had eased, replaced by an airy quiet. Carol greeted him with a gentle smile, not clinging, not overly eager, just present. Hank walked from room to room, noticing small changes. Clean counters, open blinds, fresh flowers on the table. The house felt lighter, warmer. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like a place he could breathe. He stood in the doorway of the living room, absorbing it all, the calm, the stillness, the fragile peace forming around them. "Welcome home," Carol whispered behind him. Hank exhaled slowly. "It feels different." Carol nodded. "It is." He believed her, because he felt it too. The storm had passed. The wounds were still tender. But the house, his home, was finally letting in light again. And for the first time in a long time, Hank didn't feel like a man fighting shadows. He felt like a man beginning to rebuild. The mornings felt different now, quieter, softer, as if the house itself was trying to make amends. Hank woke before the sun most days, not out of worry or sleeplessness, but out of a growing desire to reclaim the hours he thought he'd lost. He brewed coffee, sat at the small kitchen table with a pen and a notebook, and began journaling. It wasn't poetry or anything flowery, just simple entries, what he remembered from yesterday, what he needed to do today, how he felt waking up. Dr. Keller had suggested tracking memories as both a grounding exercise and a diagnostic tool. At first, Hank resisted. Writing down his thoughts felt like admitting weakness. But gradually, something surprising happened. The pages began forming a map, a record of clarity, proof that his mind wasn't slipping away the way he once feared. Carol would find him there some mornings, glasses perched low on his nose, head bowed slightly as he wrote. She never interrupted, never hovered. She would simply place a mug of warm tea beside him and whisper, "Let me know if you need help remembering anything." Not in a patronizing way, just supportive, gentle, careful. These were the kinds of changes Hank could accept. Respectful, measured, rooted in partnership rather than secrecy. Later in the mornings, they often drove together to their joint therapy sessions with Dr. Evelyn Pratt. At first, the conversations felt raw, exposed nerves, old wounds that hadn't fully scabbed yet. Carol struggled with guilt. Hank wrestled with resentment. Some sessions were exhausting. Others were filled with breakthrough moments that let them breathe again. One rainy Thursday, Evelyn asked them to practice a simple exercise. What's one thing you need from the other person today? Not for the rest of your life, not forever, just today. Hank thought about it and answered, "Patience. I'm still learning how to trust again." Carol's eyes softened. "And I need honesty, even if it's uncomfortable." It wasn't dramatic, but it shifted something. Suddenly, the room didn't feel so heavy. One week blended into the next. Hank found himself falling into a new rhythm: walks after breakfast, journaling in the afternoon, reading in the evenings. Carol helped him build routines that honored his independence, labeled drawers so he didn't have to search for things, reminder cards on the fridge, small check-ins that didn't feel invasive. The biggest change came unexpectedly, on a day Hank thought would be ordinary. Evan showed up. Mark's younger brother stood on the porch holding a bag of groceries, wearing a warm but cautious smile. "Mom said you were settling back in," he said. "Thought I'd stop by, just talk." Evan was the kind of person who didn't push, didn't pry, didn't assume. Hank invited him in, and they spent most of the afternoon in conversation about cars, old memories, the property, even light jokes that managed to lift some of the heaviness inside Hank's chest. At one point, Evan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I don't want to take sides," he said carefully, "but I'm here if you need someone who's not tangled up in the middle of things." It was the first neutral support Hank had felt in a long time, and he appreciated it more deeply than he could say. Carol brought out iced tea and sat with them, listening, adding in small pieces. The three of them spoke in a way that felt normal, something the family hadn't tasted in months. Later that evening, Hank and Carol sat on the porch watching the sun go down. The sky glowed in shades of orange and lavender. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass near the edge of the yard. "You seemed lighter today," Carol said softly. "I did feel lighter," Hank admitted. "It's good to have someone who sees things without picking a side." Carol nodded. Evan's always been steady, quiet but steady. Hank took a slow breath, then another. "I've been thinking about boundaries," he said. "Not barriers, boundaries." Carol looked at him carefully. "What kind of boundaries?" "Honesty," Hank said. "Above everything. If something changes with my health, I want to know first. If Mark needs help again, if there's trouble, if anything affects us, I want truth, not protection." Carol's shoulders dropped in relief. "I can do that." "And Mark," Hank paused, his voice turned somber. "He needs space, and I need space from him." Carol swallowed. "He's been keeping his distance. Counseling is helping, slowly. He's ashamed, Hank, truly ashamed." "I know," Hank murmured, "but forgiveness can't be rushed." They sat quietly for a while, letting the cicadas fill the air. In the weeks that followed, Hank continued to rebuild. Therapy helped, journaling helped, Carol's consisting. Why helped? And the absence of secrecy, the clean air of truth, helped most of all. Mark remained on the periphery, attending counseling, sending occasional respectful messages through Carol. No pressure, no demands, just quiet rebuilding from afar. It was the first step Hank needed. And then one morning, something unexpected happened. As Hank finished writing in his journal, he realized he was smiling. Not because everything was perfect, not because the past was erased, but because, for the first time in a long time, he felt anchored in his own life again, present, aware, capable, grounded. Carol walked in and paused when she saw the expression on his face. "Good morning," she said softly. "It is," Hank replied. And he meant it. The house still carried echoes of what had happened, but the weight had lifted. It felt like a home again, not a battlefield, not a place of secrets. Just a quiet home with two people trying their best, one day at a time. And that, Hank realized, was enough to keep moving forward. The late autumn light filtered through the living room curtains in thin golden stripes when Carol stepped softly into Hank's study. She paused in the doorway, hands clasped, eyes careful. "Hank," she said gently, "Mark asked if he could come by today. He wants to talk to you." Hank looked up from his journal, pen paused mid-sentence. He felt a slow, heavy shift inside his chest, something between dread and a readiness he hadn't recognized until now. "Is he here?" Carol nodded. "He's waiting on the porch." Hank closed the journal, smoothed his hand over the cover, and stood. "All right," he said. "Let's talk." He stepped outside into the crisp air. Mark stood near the railing, shoulders rounded, hands shoved deep in his pockets. He looked smaller somehow, less defensive, less inflated by fear or pride. Just a man carrying consequences. When he saw his father, Mark took a breath that shook slightly. "Dad, thanks for agreeing to this." Hank crossed his arms, not hostile but clear. "Say what you came to say." Mark nodded, swallowing hard. I've been working with the counselor, and I know that doesn't erase anything, but I needed to tell you everything face to face. No excuses, no pushing it onto Mom, no pretending." Hank stayed quiet, letting the silence make space. Mark's eyes glistened as he spoke. "I manipulated both of you. I used your diagnosis, what little I understood of it, to justify my decisions. I forged those signatures. I hid the debt. I hid the panic. I pushed Mom into choices she never should have been responsible for." His voice broke. "I didn't do it because I didn't love you. I did it because I was drowning and terrified and selfish." The honesty in his voice hit Hank deeper than he expected. Mark continued, wiping his eyes with the back of his sleeve. "Dad, I'm sorry for all of it. For the lies, the control, the guardianship filing, everything. You didn't deserve any of it." Hank let the words sit in the cold air between them. Apologies were easy. Accountability wasn't. He studied his son, the same boy he'd taught to ride a bike, the same teenager who'd struggled through college, the same adult who had grown more withdrawn each year. "You hurt me," Hank finally said, voice low, "deeply, in ways I'm still understanding." "I know," Mark's voice cracked again, "and I won't ask you to forgive me today. I want you to know I'm taking responsibility." Hank nodded slowly. "Then tell me how." Mark straightened slightly as if bracing himself. "I spoke with a financial counselor. I'm setting up a repayment plan for the debts, all of them. No shortcuts, no family bailing me out. And I talked to an attorney about the forged documents." His throat tightened. "I'll face whatever charges come. I'm not hiding anymore." A quiet wind rustled through the maple trees. Hank felt something loosen inside him, not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement, respect. Mark was not making excuses. He was not deflecting blame. He was standing in the mess he created. "That's good," Hank said softly. "That's what I needed to hear." Mark exhaled, a shaky breath that seemed to release months of tension. "I want to earn your trust back. Not ask for it, earn it." "You will," Hank said. "But slowly. I'm keeping my boundaries. No financial decisions involving me. No signing anything on my behalf. No stepping into my medical choices. Those lines are firm." Mark nodded vigorously. "I understand. I respect that." Hank studied him another moment, weighing the sincerity in his son's eyes. And then, quietly, he extended a hand. Mark looked at it, stunned. Then he grasped it, both of his hands wrapping around Hank's, as if holding on to something fragile and desperately needed. "Thank you," Mark whispered. "I won't waste this." Carol watched from inside the doorway, tears slipping down her face. Not grief this time, relief. She stepped out cautiously, unsure if she belonged in the moment, but Hank turned to her and nodded. "It's all right," he murmured. Mark gave her a small, broken smile. "Mom, I'm sorry for everything I dragged you into." Carol reached for him slowly, as if approaching an injured animal. "I know," she whispered. "I know you are." They embraced gently, a tentative rebuilding, like stitching a fabric that had torn clean through. Later, as Mark drove away, Hank stood beside Carol on the porch. The evening light settled warmly across the yard, and for the first time in a long while, Hank's chest felt open. "He meant it," Carol said softly. "Yes," Hank replied, "I think he did." She looked at him with quiet hope. "Do you feel lighter?" He waited a moment, searching inside himself. Yes, he said, and he realized it was true. The distance was still there, the wound still healing, but the family, broken, battered, stitched with rough edges, was beginning slowly to mend. And Hank, for the first time in months, felt the faint return of peace. Snow drifted lightly across the yard the morning Hank made his decision. The house smelled faintly of pine from the tree Carol decorated earlier that week. Nothing extravagant, just white lights and a few ornaments they'd collected across 40 years. It felt like a fitting backdrop for something he hadn't done in a long time. Extend an invitation born not from obligation, but from hope. He stood in the hallway, phone in hand, staring at Mark's number longer than necessary. His thumb hovered, then pressed call. When Mark answered, his voice was cautious, almost fragile. "Dad." Hank kept his tone steady. "We're having Christmas dinner here, 6 o'clock, if you'd like to come." A pause, then Mark exhaled slowly. "I'd really like that, thank you." After he hung up, Hank found Carol in the kitchen, preparing a pot of broth for the roast. She glanced at him, reading something different in his expression. "You called him," she said. "I did." Carol nodded, wiping her hands on a towel. "Good." Evening came early, painting the windows a soft blue-gray. Carol lit candles, subtle ones, not overly festive, while Hank set the table himself. Each plate, each fork, each folded napkin felt like an act of intention, a quiet rebuilding. When he placed the last glass, headlights swept across the front window. "Mark." He stepped onto the porch slowly, shoulders tight, hands clutching a wrapped package. He paused at the door, as if unsure whether he belonged. Hank opened it before he could knock. "Hi, Dad," Mark said, voice low but respectful. "Come on in," Hank replied. Mark entered with deliberate care, removing his coat, brushing snow from his hair. Carol greeted him with a soft, uncertain smile. They hugged, brief, gentle, real. Dinner began quietly. The clink of silverware, the crackle of the fireplace, the faint carols drifting from the radio filled the silence where tension once lived. Mark complimented the roast. Carol asked about his counseling sessions. Hank offered small pieces of conversation not forced, not strained, simply natural. As the meal continued, something subtle shifted. Maybe it was the warmth of the room. Maybe it was the shared desire to let the past sit without dominating the present. Maybe forgiveness, in its slow, imperfect way, had started taking root. When the plates were cleared and the candles burned low, Hank stood and cleared his throat. "I have something for you," he said to Carol. She looked surprised as Hank reached behind the sideboard and pulled out a thin box wrapped in plain silver paper. She opened it slowly, uncharacteristically nervous. Inside was a framed photograph, a black and white print of their wedding day. The old picture had frayed edges, but the smiles were unmistakable. Carol radiant in her simple dress, Hank young and certain, their hands intertwined. Carol's breath caught. "Hank, where did you find this?" "It was in an old album in the attic," he said. "Thought it should be somewhere we can see it." She traced the corner of the frame with her thumb, tears building gently, not from sadness, but from a kind of healing that didn't need words. "Thank you," she whispered. "This means more than I can say." Hank nodded, emotion tightening his throat in a way he didn't fight. Then Mark cleared his throat. I brought something too." He reached for the wrapped package, hands trembling slightly. Hank accepted it, untying the ribbon. Inside was a thick, leather-bound book with an embossed title. "Dad's Memories." Hank opened it and froze. Each page held a prompt. "Write about your first job. Write about the best day you've ever had. Write about someone you miss. Write a memory from each decade of your life." Some pages already had photos Mark had found. Young Hank in his mechanic's shop. A fishing trip decades ago. The boys on a rusty swing set. Carol laughing beside a broken mower they'd tried to fix together. Mark swallowed hard. The counselor suggested this, said it might help with tracking memories, but I didn't want it to be clinical. I wanted it to be ours. Hank ran his hand over the pages slowly. The gesture felt sacred, grounding, bittersweet. He looked up at his son, truly looked, and saw not manipulation, not fear, not control, but remorse, effort, and a man trying to rebuild from the wreckage of his own making. "Thank you," Hank said quietly. "This means a lot." Mark nodded, blinking back emotion. "I'm glad." The three of them sat in the glow of the fire for a long time after that. No more tense breaths, no sharp edges, just warmth, the kind of warmth Hank thought he'd lost forever. He looked around the room, at the family he'd almost lost, at the peace settling carefully over the house like falling snow. For the first time in months, gratitude, not resentment, filled his chest. The home felt warm again, alive again. The winter outside couldn't touch the quiet healing happening inside these walls. It was imperfect, fragile, human. And it was enough. The house was silent in the soft blue hush of early evening. Snow pressed gently against the windows, muting the outside world until it felt like the entire farmhouse existed in a bubble of quiet calm. Hank eased himself into his favorite chair, the old, worn leather recliner that had shaped itself to him over the years. It creaked in that familiar, comforting way, like it recognized him, like it had been waiting. He sank back and let the warmth of the nearby fireplace ease into his bones. This was the first still moment he'd had since Christmas dinner. No planning, no therapy appointments, no tense conversations waiting around corners. Just quiet. And in that quiet, memories rose. He thought back to those terrifying nights when everything had begun. The creaking floorboards, the hushed whispers, the shadows moving downstairs long after midnight. He remembered lying awake, heart pounding, convinced they were plotting something against him, convinced that the people he loved most were turning the house into a maze of secrets. He remembered the panic, the dread, the confusion. He remembered the feeling of betrayal, so sharp it had cut through him like a blade. Hank rubbed his palms against the armrests slowly, grounding himself in the present. The fire crackled softly. The house, once tense and heavy, now breathed with a kind of earned peace. He exhaled. They weren't trying to hurt him. They weren't trying to take anything from him. They weren't waiting for him to fall asleep so they could make decisions against him. They were waiting because they were scared too. Scared of upsetting him. Scared of overwhelming him. Scared of what the diagnosis could become. Scared of watching the man who had always been their anchor begin to drift. They didn't know how to talk to him openly. Not yet, not then. Flawed decisions. Wrong methods. But it had all come from a place that was difficult for Hank to deny now. Love. The kind of love that panics when it sees someone slipping. The kind of love that clings too tightly. The kind of love that chooses secrecy over confrontation, thinking it's kinder. Hank swallowed hard, eyes stinging. "You were trying to save me," he whispered into the quiet room, "in the wrong way." A soft rustle came from the doorway. "Carol." She didn't speak. She didn't ask what he was thinking or why his voice sounded fragile. She simply walked toward him with slow, deliberate steps and sat on the ottoman in front of his chair. Her hands, small, warm, trembling, found his. He held them gently, letting the warmth of her touch settle into him. They didn't need words right now, not after everything they dragged themselves through. Some healing didn't speak, it just breathed. After a moment, footsteps came down the stairs. Mark appeared hesitantly, as if checking the temperature of the room before entering it fully. He had grown quieter in these past weeks, more thoughtful. The edges of him, once sharp with fear and defensiveness, had softened. "You okay, Dad?" he asked, voice cautious but sincere. Hank nodded. "Yeah, just thinking." Mark gave a small, understanding smile. "About everything." Hank huffed a quiet breath that was almost a laugh. "About everything." Carol squeezed his hands. Mark leaned against the railing, watching them with a mixture of guilt and hope, a complicated blend that had become familiar lately. They stood there, the three of them, not perfect, not fully healed, but undeniably together. Hank looked at them, his wife, weathered by fear but anchored by love. His son, flawed and wounded but trying, truly trying. His family, fractured by secrets but stitched back together through truth, forgiveness, and the bruising work of rebuilding. For the first time in months, Hank felt no tightness in his chest, no question mark hanging over every interaction, no dread hiding in the dark corners of the house. Just gratitude. Gratitude that they made it through. Gratitude that the truth had surfaced. Gratitude that love, messy, imperfect human love, had survived the storm. He tightened his grip around Carol's hand and looked between them. "You know," he said softly, "I finally understand why you waited those nights." Carol's eyes filled, but she didn't interrupt. "You weren't hiding from me," Hank continued. "You weren't plotting, you weren't pulling away." He shook his head gently. "You were trying to protect me in the only way you knew how." Carol lowered her forehead to his hand. Mark blinked hard, looking away for a moment. Hank leaned back into his chair, voice steady as he spoke the final truth, the one that finally let the last of the bitterness fall away. "Every night they waited for me to sleep, because they loved me, not because they were leaving me behind.